And those limitations are, for example, the Bill of Rights that William and Mary signed in 1689. That becomes part of this Constitution, these constitutional obligations and restrictions that William and Mary will face. Okay? And what's interesting is that William and Mary are fine with being constitutional monarchs, which was not something that was true with the Stuarts, the earlier Stuart dynasty of James II, Mary's father. Okay. Just for your English monarchies, we start with the Tudors. When Elizabeth dies, it's the end of the Tudors. So the Scottish monarchy takes over. That's the Stuarts. And after the James II is overthrown by his daughter, William and Mary, so the Stuarts are still in place through Mary. And then I believe Mary's sister Anne becomes the queen for a little while. And then after that, we get this new Hanover dynasty, the Hanoverian dynasty, which is really easy to remember in the 18th century England. And it's basically George I, George II, and George III. And you might be wondering, why would that be? But just remember that Hanover is an area in Germany. And so this is a royal family that they bring to England from Germany. And they invite this royal family to be the new royal family because they are not Catholic. And the Stuarts are Catholic under James II's line. And so they invite, this Parliament invites this new German Protestant family, the Hanovers, to be there. Now, why don't you really remember this? Because, remember, what does the 1688 Glorious Revolution symbolize? It symbolizes the rise of Parliament. And so, therefore, from this point forward, we've talked about Parliament. We've talked about the Whigs and the Tories and Robert Walpole and Disraeli and Gladstone as we go forward, and reform bills within Parliament that they pass. So we haven't been talking about kings in England anymore, which is why, just as an aside, when people told me earlier this week that the whole marriage between whoever and whoever was history, I thought it's an insult to the subject, right? Because history, just because something is anachronistic, something is left over from the past, does not mean it's history anymore. It's just sort of some silly thing left over from the past, right? So, I don't know. A history was made with Mr. Bin Laden's capture and, execution. But history was, that other thing. That was a waste of time. Okay, now moving on. Montesquieu, like Locke, is questioning an absolutist government. Montesquieu goes to England. He's an Enlightenment philosopher. He goes to England and he sees, hey, look, I like this system. Montesquieu's a critic of Louis XIV's absolutism. And he's a critic because Louis XIV, of course, censored things and didn't allow religious toleration. And so Montesquieu went to England and he found a more open environment in which there was religious toleration, except for Jews and Catholics. But for everyone else, there was religious toleration after the Toleration Act of 1689. And there was also a more open environment. There wasn't the same censorship that we saw in France. And so Montesquieu writes in his Spirit of the Laws, the book that you want to remember for Montesquieu, Montesquieu writes how the ideal governmental system does have checks on royal power. That there's checks on royal power. And he's looking at England, he says that there are 3 branches of government. And the executive, or the king, is checked by the legislature, or parliament. And Montesquieu also notes how the courts are separate from royal interference. So the law courts are a separate branch. And so that's the judicial branch. Now, of course, these 3 branches, the executive, legislative, and judicial, will be sort of combined in the, or will be the model for the Constitution of 1787 here in the United States, and the model for many other liberal countries going forward. So Montesquieu plays a very important role, similar to Locke, in influencing the political direction of the United States. Now, what's interesting about Voltaire is that Voltaire is this critic, he's this writer. He's not actually that interested in government. For Voltaire, what he wants is the ability to say what he wants to say and associate with whom he wants to associate and think and believe what he wants to believe. So for him, the freedom of expression is paramount. And as long as the government protects the freedom of expression, and included in that, of course, is the religious freedom, as long as the government protects the freedom of expression and religious freedom, Voltaire has no problem with a monarchy. In fact, Voltaire often thinks that a monarchy could be better than, say, a parliament dominated by nobles that think that they're better than everyone else and are entitled to historical privileges because of their noble status. In fact, Voltaire thinks that monarchs can be enlightened. And he's friends, for example, with Frederick II. Who was? Yeah. Frederick II. Frederick the Great, yes, okay. He's friends with Frederick the Great, or Frederick II of Prussia, living for a while in Prussia at his palace. And so he is a philosopher who shows how most philosophers are not opposed to monarchies. Most philosophers are not democrats. They don't want people to vote, everyone to vote, because the masses are kind of ignorant and not really educated. So the best way to bring about enlightenment is by having smart people in charge. And so that is enlightened absolutism. And so Voltaire is an early sort of philosopher, or an early critic who's pointing out the advantages of enlightened absolutism. And of course, you know that our great examples of enlightened absolutism are Frederick II, Joseph II, and Catherine II, all of whom are, well, Catherine the Great, that's her nickname, and Frederick the Great, they get those great suffixes.
Or Joseph.
Okay, Joseph not so much, even though he did the most in terms of Enlightenment reforms in Austria, but many of them are redacted right after he's gone. That's a kind of strange word to use. They are overturned after he is gone. Now, it is important to think, whenever you're writing an essay about these isms, what is the actual, on-the-ground examples of this? In other words, when we've got this example of Voltaire defending enlightened absolutism, if you're writing about it, you must include examples from actual history. So use examples from Frederick or Joseph or Catherine. Okay? And as we go through, we'll see more examples, and I'll be sure to mention specifics that you want to mention. Now, Rousseau also is Rousseau is also a philosopher, and his idea is a little different from those of Montesquieu and Voltaire, but just as important for American history as that of Voltaire, or as Montesquieu.